When he saw her tears, the mountain man stepped forward. His next move at the altar stunned the entire town.
The heavy church doors didn't just open, they were violently thrown wide, slamming against the timber walls. Sunlight poured into the dusty aisle, framing the towering, rugged silhouette of the mountain man. He didn't care about the gasps or the loaded shotguns. He only cared about the single tear tracing down the bride's pale cheek. The town of Oak Haven, Colorado, in the late autumn of 1882, was a place where dreams went to die, under the heavy boots of ruthless men. It was a mining and timber settlement nestled deep in a valley, perpetually shadowed by the towering, jagged peaks of the Crimson Ridge. The wind here always smelled of pine resin, coal dust, and desperation. For most of the townsfolk, life was a daily grind of survival. But for Abigail Mercer, life had suddenly become a prison sentence. Abigail was a woman of quiet, enduring beauty. She possessed a spirit that belonged out on the open plains, not boxed into the stifling societal confines of Oak Haven. Her hair was the color of roasted chestnuts, and her eyes held the vibrant green of the high meadow grasses. But lately, those eyes were shadowed with an inescapable exhaustion. Her father, William Mercer, a man whose back had been broken by years of failing harvests and a stubborn pride, had finally hit the end of his rope. A brutal winter, followed by a summer of merciless drought, had decimated their cattle herd and withered their crops. To keep the bank from foreclosing on the homestead that had been in their family for 2 generations, William had taken out a secondary loan. The man holding the deed to the Mercer farm was Josiah Trent. Josiah was the owner of the Oak Haven Bank and Trust, a man whose wealth was only matched by his cruelty. He wore imported wool suits that looked entirely out of place in the dusty streets of the frontier town, and his smile was as cold and sharp as a straight razor. He had coveted Abigail Mercer for years, viewing her not as a woman, but as a prize, the final, beautiful ornament to adorn his sprawling, newly built mansion on the hill. When William Mercer defaulted on the impossible interest rates of the loan, Josiah had offered a simple, sickening proposition. Give him Abigail's hand in marriage, and the debt would be wiped clean. The farm would remain with the Mercer family. If they refused, Josiah would have the sheriff throw William out into the snow, penniless and broken. Trapped, utterly terrified for her ailing father's survival, Abigail had agreed. News of the engagement spread through Oak Haven like a wildfire. The townsfolk whispered in the mercantile, in the saloon, and on the wooden boardwalks. They all knew it was a transaction of flesh and land, a coerced surrender. But no one dared speak out against Josiah Trent. He owned half the town's businesses and had the local sheriff, a cowardly man named Ezekiel Cobb, resting comfortably in his deep pockets. However, there was one man in Oak Haven who answered to no banker, no sheriff, and no societal law. His name was Gideon Hayes. Gideon lived high up on the treacherous slopes of the Crimson Ridge, far above the petty squabbles and greed of the valley. He was a mountain man in the truest sense, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and eyes the color of a stormy gray sky. He wore buckskin and worn leather, carried a Winchester rifle that he treated with religious reverence, and bore the scars of a man who had fought grizzlies, harsh winters, and his own dark past. He came down to Oak Haven only once a month to trade pelts, carved wooden goods, and gold dust for coffee, salt, and ammunition. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth. He was a ghost of the high country, a man wrapped in dangerous silence. It was a brittle, cold Tuesday when Gideon brought his pack mule into town. He tied the animal outside Miller's General Store, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks of the porch. As he pushed through the swinging doors, the bell jingling overhead, the usual chatter inside the store died down. Gideon paid it no mind. He walked to the counter, dropped a heavy sack of premium beaver pelts, and began his transaction with Mr. Miller. While Miller was nervously weighing the furs, the door chimed again. Gideon turned his head slightly, his sharp instincts picking up the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Abigail Mercer had walked in. She was accompanied by Josiah Trent, who gripped her elbow with a possessive, almost bruising tightness. Abigail's face was pale, her shoulders rigid. She looked at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Josiah, meanwhile, beamed with a sickening arrogance. He steered her toward the fabric counter to look at silk for her wedding dress. speaking to her in a low, condescending tone that made Gideon's jaw clench instinctively. Gideon had seen Abigail before, over the years. He had always admired her quiet strength, the way she handled wild horses with a gentle touch, the way she carried water from the creek with her chin held high. She was a fixture of the valley's natural beauty. But the woman standing in the store today looked like a trapped doe waiting for the slaughter. As Josiah turned to loudly demand service from Mrs. Miller, Abigail briefly looked up. Her eyes, brimming with an unspeakable trapped sorrow, met Gideon's stormy gray gaze. For 3 agonizing seconds, time in the general store stood entirely still. Gideon saw the profound despair clawing at her soul. He saw the faint purple bruise blooming on her wrist where Josiah was gripping her. He saw the tears she was fighting so desperately to hold back. Abigail quickly looked away, ashamed, but the damage was done. The silent plea in her eyes had struck the mountain man like a physical blow. Gideon turned back to the counter, gathered his supplies, and walked out into the cold air. But as he mounted his horse to head back up the ridge, he didn't ride toward the mountains. He rode toward the edge of town, his mind churning with a dangerous, protective fury. The wilderness had taught Gideon one absolute truth. You do not let a predator play with its prey. The wedding was set for Sunday, a mere 5 days away. The haste of the arrangement only fueled the vicious gossip in Oakhaven. Josiah Trent was eager to seal the deal, paranoid that William Mercer might somehow find a miraculous way to pay off the debt, or worse, that Abigail might find the courage to flee into the night. To prevent this, Josiah had stationed 2 of his hired enforcers outside the Mercer farm, ostensibly to protect his bride-to-be, but everyone knew they were wardens guarding a prisoner. Up on Crimson Ridge, the biting wind howled through the pines, but Gideon Hayes sat by his fire, entirely consumed by the memory of Abigail's face. He was a man who had sworn off the affairs of civilized men. After surviving the horrors of the war, he had retreated to the mountains to find peace, to live honestly under the vast, uncaring sky. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself that a mountain man had no place interfering with the town's legal contracts, no matter how deeply immoral they were. But the mountain man's conscience refused to be silenced. On Wednesday night, shrouded in darkness and a heavy wool blanket, Gideon slipped down the mountain and moved into Oakhaven like a shadow. He didn't go to the saloon. He bypassed the brothel and the hotel. Instead, he slipped through the alleyways toward the back of the Oakhaven Bank and Trust. Gideon knew that men like Josiah Trent didn't become wealthy and powerful by playing fair. Predators of his kind always left a trail. They were just arrogant enough to believe no one would ever track it. Using a hunting knife, Gideon picked the simple lock on the banker's rear window and slid into the opulent mahogany-scented office. He struck a single match, keeping the flame cupped in his calloused hands, and began rifling through Josiah's private ledger books hidden in the bottom drawer of a heavy oak desk. Gideon might have looked like an uneducated savage to the townsfolk, but he was a highly literate man who understood numbers just as well as he understood the tracks of a mountain lion. It took him 2 hours to find the discrepancy. It was buried under layers of convoluted interest rates and false foreclosures. Josiah Trent hadn't just trapped William Mercer. He had actively manufactured the crisis. The ledger revealed that Josiah had deliberately dammed the upper creek that fed the Mercer farm, causing the devastating drought that ruined their crops. Furthermore, the interest rates applied to the Mercer loan were entirely illegal under territorial law. Doctored after William had signed the papers, Josiah had forged William's initials on the updated contract. It was a calculated, cold-blooded theft designed specifically to steal Abigail. Gideon's blood ran cold and then boiled over. He folded the incriminating ledger pages, tucked them into his leather vest, and slipped back out into the night. The next evening, Thursday, Abigail sat in her small bedroom at the farmhouse. The wedding dress, a lavish, grotesque mountain of white silk and imported lace that Josiah had purchased, hung on her wardrobe like a ghost waiting to possess her. She felt entirely hollowed out. Her father was asleep in the next room, coughing weakly. She had resigned herself to her fate. She would sacrifice her body, her freedom, and her soul so that her father could die in his own bed. Suddenly, a soft thud drew her attention to the window. Abigail startled, her heart hammering in her chest. She approached the glass cautiously, half expecting to see one of Josiah's thugs peering in at her. Instead, she saw the empty expanse of the moonlit prairie. But resting on the outer sill of her window was an object. She carefully raised the sash and picked it up. It was a piece of smooth, polished cedar wood, intricately carved into the shape of a soaring hawk. Abigail ran her thumb over the detailed feathers. It was beautiful, crafted with a profound, rugged tenderness. She immediately knew who had left it, the giant mountain man from the general store. She remembered the intense, stormy gray eyes that had locked onto hers, seeing right through her brave facade. She clutched the wooden hawk to her chest, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to cry. Not tears of despair, but tears of a strange, fragile hope. She wasn't entirely invisible. Someone in this dark, cold world had seen her pain. Friday and Saturday passed in a blur of agonizing preparations. Josiah paraded Abigail around town, forcing her to smile at the baker, the jeweler, and the dressmaker. Every time he touched her waist, Abigail felt a physical revulsion that made her stomach churn. Josiah, sensing her resistance, leaned in close during a walk down Main Street. "You play the dutiful, happy bride tomorrow, Abigail," Josiah hissed in her ear, his breath smelling of stale cigars and peppermint. "Or I swear to the Almighty I will not only take the farm, but I will have the sheriff arrest your father for fraud. He'll die coughing blood in a territorial prison. Do you understand me?" Abigail nodded numbly, her spirit finally breaking. "I understand, Josiah." Up on the ridge, Gideon was preparing his own arrangements. He meticulously cleaned his Winchester, loaded his Colt revolver, and saddled his massive black stallion, Midnight. He looked down at the flickering lights of Oak Haven in the valley below. The town thought it was preparing for a wedding. Gideon knew it was preparing for a reckoning. Sunday morning dawned cold and brilliantly clear. The First Congregational Church of Oak Haven was packed to the rafters. Every pew was filled with townsfolk clad in their Sunday best. The air was thick with the smell of cheap perfume, mothballs, and the underlying tension of a town witnessing a polite kidnapping. At the front of the church stood Josiah Trent, looking immaculately tailored in a charcoal suit and a silk ascot. He exuded an aura of total triumph. Beside him stood Sheriff Ezekiel Cobb, acting as his best man, sweating nervously under the heavy scrutiny of the congregation. Reverend Higgins, a frail man who feared the banker as much as everyone else, stood at the pulpit, nervously shuffling his Bible. Then the pump organ began to play a wheezing, somber march. The congregation turned as the back doors opened. Abigail Mercer appeared, leaning heavily on the arm of her frail father, William. She was a vision in white silk, but to anyone with a shred of empathy, she looked like a lamb being led to the sacrificial altar. Her face was ashen, her eyes downcast, her hands trembled so violently that the lace of her bouquet shook like autumn leaves in the wind. Every step she took down the wooden aisle felt like a nail being driven into her own coffin. William kissed his daughter's cheek, a tear escaping his eye as he handed her over to Josiah. Josiah snatched her hand with a victorious smirk, his grip painfully tight. He didn't even look at William. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Higgins began, his voice trembling slightly, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Abigail stared straight ahead at the wooden cross on the wall. She felt a tear detach from her eyelashes and trace a hot, slow path down her pale cheek. It was the absolute manifestation of her surrender. Her life was over. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter hold his peace. Reverend Higgins paused. It was a procedural pause, one he always made, expecting nothing but the shuffling of feet and the clearing of throats. Instead, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church exploded open with a violent crash that shook the stained glass windows. The pump organ let out a discordant shriek and died. The congregation collectively gasped, twisting in their pews. Sheriff Cobb immediately dropped his hand to his holster. Josiah Trent spun around, his face instantly twisting from triumph to furious outrage. Standing in the doorway, blocking out the morning sun, was Gideon Hayes. He had not worn a suit. He wore his heavy leather duster, his rugged boots coated in mountain dust. His Winchester rifle was slung casually over his shoulder, but the menacing aura he projected filled the entire sanctuary. His stormy gray eyes swept the room, ignoring the terrified whispers of the townsfolk, ignoring the panicked sheriff. His gaze locked with laser precision onto Abigail, who had turned to look at him, her breath catching in her throat. Gideon began to walk down the aisle. His boots echoed like thunderclaps on the wooden floorboards. The crowd shrank back from him, pulling their skirts and children out of his path. The sheer, overwhelming masculinity and suppressed violence radiating from the mountain man was paralyzing. "What is the meaning of this?" Josiah bellowed, his voice cracking with indignity. "Sheriff, arrest this wild animal! Throw him out!" Sheriff Cobb drew his pistol, but his hand was shaking so badly he could barely aim it. "Now hold on there, Hayes. You can't just barge into a holy ceremony." Gideon didn't even break his stride. In one fluid, lightning-fast motion, he reached under his duster, drew his Colt revolver, and leveled it directly at the sheriff's chest. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The cold, dead-eyed promise in Gideon's stare communicated exactly what would happen if Cobb didn't holster his weapon. Cobb swallowed hard, his face turning pale, and slowly slid his gun back into its leather sheath. Gideon stopped 10 feet from the altar. He looked at Josiah Trent, his expression a mask of absolute disgust. "There will be no wedding today." Gideon's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that resonated in the chest of everyone present. It wasn't a shout. It was a command of nature, like the rumbling of an impending avalanche. "You savage," Josiah spat, stepping in front of Abigail as if to shield his property. "You have no jurisdiction here. You have no right. This woman is entering a legal, binding marriage to satisfy a debt. She belongs to me." "She belongs to no man," Gideon rumbled, taking another slow step forward. "And the debt is a lie." Gasps rippled through the pews. William Mercer stood up from the front row, clutching his chest. "What? What are you saying, Hayes?" Gideon reached into his heavy vest and pulled out the folded ledger pages. He tossed them onto the floor directly at Josiah's feet. "I'm saying that your banker here doctored the interest rates after you signed the contract, Mercer. I'm saying he paid Ezekiel Cobb to look the other way, while his men dammed the upper creek to starve your land of water. He engineered your ruin so he could buy your daughter like a piece of livestock." The church erupted into chaos. Men began to shout. Women gasped in horror. William Mercer's face turned scarlet with rage as he lunged toward Josiah, only to be held back by 2 other townsmen. Josiah's face drained of color. He looked down at his own private ledger pages, the undeniable proof of his fraud lying on the church floor. Panic flashed in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by desperate, venomous anger. "Lies! Forgeries created by a crazy mountain rat. Sheriff, I order you to shoot this man." But Cobb was backing away, holding his hands up in surrender, realizing the tide of the town had instantly turned against them. Josiah, realizing his power was evaporating in seconds, did the only thing a cornered rat could do. He reached inside his tailored coat and pulled a small silver Derringer pistol, aiming it directly at Gideon's face. Abigail screamed. Before Josiah's finger could twitch on the trigger, Gideon moved. He closed the distance with terrifying speed, his large hand snapping out like a bear trap. He grabbed Josiah's wrist, twisting it violently. The crack of breaking bone echoed through the silent church. Josiah let out a high-pitched shriek as the silver pistol clattered uselessly to the floor. Gideon then grabbed the banker by the lapels of his expensive suit and violently shoved him backward. Josiah crashed into the pulpit, sending Reverend Higgins' Bible flying, before crumbling to the floor in a whimpering heap, clutching his shattered wrist. The church was dead silent, save for the pathetic groans of the ruined banker. Gideon slowly turned his back on Josiah, dismissing him completely. He stepped up onto the altar platform. He stood inches away from Abigail. She was looking up at him, her green eyes wide, her chest heaving, trembling like a leaf. The heavy veil and the oppressive silk dress made her look fragile, but Gideon saw the fierce, unyielding fire of the woman beneath it all. Gideon reached out with a hand that was rough with calluses and scarred by the wilderness. With a gentleness that defied his massive, intimidating frame, he reached up and softly wiped the single tear from Abigail's cheek. "You don't ever have to cry for this town again," Gideon said softly, his stormy eyes locking onto hers, speaking only to her. "If you want to walk out those doors, I will clear the path. And heaven help the man who tries to stop you." Abigail stared at the calloused hand that had just wiped away her despair. The silence in the first Congregational Church was absolute, broken only by the ragged, painful wheezing of Josiah Trent on the floor. For months, Abigail had been suffocating under the weight of duty, societal expectations, and the terrifying power of a corrupt banker. But looking into Gideon's stormy gray eyes, the illusion of Josiah's power shattered completely. The town of Oakhaven and all its judgmental stares suddenly meant nothing. With trembling hands that quickly grew steady, Abigail reached up and grabbed the thick, stifling collar of the imported silk wedding dress. She pulled violently. The expensive fabric tore with a loud, satisfying rip, popping pearl buttons across the wooden floorboards. She cast the heavy, oppressive veil aside, letting it fall directly onto Josiah's polished leather shoes. "I'm ready," Abigail whispered, her voice carrying a newfound fierce resonance. "Take me away from this place." William Mercer stepped forward, his eyes shining with a mixture of shock, pride, and profound relief. He reached out and grasped Gideon's forearm. "You keep her safe, Hayes. You hear me? You take her up that mountain, and you don't look back. I'll handle the fallout here. With these ledgers, Trent is finished." Gideon gave the older man a single, respectful nod. "He won't ever touch her again, Mercer. You have my word on that." Gideon placed a protective hand on the small of Abigail's back and guided her down the aisle. The sea of townsfolk parted for them instantly. No one uttered a word of protest. Sheriff Ezekiel Cobb remained pinned against the back pew, his face slick with cowardly sweat, completely unwilling to challenge the mountain man a second time. But outside the church, the situation was far from resolved. Josiah Trent had not come to his wedding without insurance. Waiting by the hitching posts were 4 of his hired enforcers, hard-eyed, ruthless men brought in from Cheyenne, who didn't care about ledgers or town politics, only the gold coins in their pockets. Their leader, a scarred man named Hollis, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust as the church doors swung open, and Gideon emerged with the bride. "Well now," Hollis sneered, resting his hand on the butt of his Colt. "Mr. Trent ain't gonna like this one bit, mountain man. I suggest you hand the pretty lady over and ride back up to the dirt hole you crawled out of." Gideon didn't flinch. He positioned Abigail slightly behind him, shielding her with his massive frame. He whistled sharply, a piercing, high-pitched sound that cut through the crisp mountain air. Instantly, his massive black stallion, Midnight, trotted over from the livery stable, saddled and ready. "Get on the horse, Abigail," Gideon commanded softly, never taking his eyes off Hollis and the 3 men fanning out across the street. "I ain't gonna ask twice, Hayes," Hollis warned, drawing his weapon. Before Hollis could even raise the barrel, Gideon's Winchester was off his shoulder and leveled. He didn't shoot to kill, he shot to dismantle. The rifle cracked like thunder. Hollis screamed as the bullet shattered his kneecap, dropping him into the dirt. In the chaotic blink of an eye, Gideon pumped the lever and fired twice more. The second shot blew the pistol cleanly out of the hand of a thug reaching for his holster, while the third took off the heel of the third man's boot, sending him sprawling into the water trough. The sheer, overwhelming speed and terrifying accuracy of the mountain man left the 4th enforcer frozen in absolute terror, his hands raised high in the air. Gideon lowered the smoking rifle. "Tell Trent if he ever sends men up Crimson Ridge, I won't be shooting at their knees." He turned, effortlessly lifting Abigail by the waist and setting her sideways onto Midnight's saddle, despite the torn remnants of her ridiculous wedding dress. Gideon swung up behind her, taking the reins. He wrapped one strong, leather-clad arm securely around her waist, pulling her back against his broad chest. "Hold on tight," he murmured near her ear. Midnight reared back, his hooves kicking up a cloud of Oakhaven dust, before charging down Main Street. They rode past the general store, past the saloon, and past the bank that Josiah Trent had used to bleed the town dry. As they hit the edge of the valley, the restrictive, cold-choked air of the settlement gave way to the sharp, pine-scented wind of the wilderness. Abigail leaned her head back against Gideon's shoulder, closing her eyes. For the first time in a year, she took a full, deep breath. The rhythmic, powerful galloping of the stallion beneath them felt like the heartbeat of the earth itself. They were leaving the cage behind. They were ascending into the wild, untamed frontier, and as the town of Oakhaven shrank to a meaningless speck in the valley below, Abigail Mercer finally felt completely, wildly alive. Abigail stared at the calloused hand that had just wiped away her despair. The silence in the first congregational church was absolute, an unnatural vacuum broken only by the ragged, painful wheezing of Josiah Trent writhing on the wooden floorboards. For agonizing months, Abigail had been suffocating under the crushing weight of familial duty, strict societal expectations, and the terrifying, inescapable power of a corrupt, wealthy banker. But looking up into the stormy gray eyes of the mountain man, the illusion of Josiah's absolute power shattered completely. The judgmental town of Oakhaven and all its condemning, whispering stares suddenly meant absolutely nothing to her. The invisible heavy iron chains previously binding her wrists suddenly snapped apart entirely. She finally saw a clear, open path forward, illuminated by sheer, extremely rugged courage. With trembling hands that miraculously and quickly grew remarkably steady, Abigail reached up and grabbed the thick, stifling, pearl-studded collar of the imported white silk wedding dress. She pulled down violently. The incredibly expensive fabric tore with a loud, profoundly satisfying rip, popping dozens of tiny pearl buttons across the polished wooden floorboards where they bounced and rolled like scattered marbles. She cast the heavy, oppressive lace veil aside, letting it fall directly onto Josiah's polished black leather shoes with a dismissive flutter. She felt a massive, suffocating weight lift from her weary shoulders. She was no longer a helpless pawn in a cruel game played by greedy men. She was a fiercely independent woman reclaiming her stolen life. She turned her beautiful, tear-stained face toward the towering, heavily armed stranger who had rescued her. "I am truly ready," Abigail whispered softly, her voice suddenly carrying a newfound, incredibly fierce resonance that echoed lightly off the vaulted, incredibly high wooden ceiling above them. "Take me away from this terrible, wretched place right now." William Mercer swiftly stepped forward from the very first row, his weathered, deeply lined eyes shining brightly with a highly complex, deeply emotional mixture of profound, staggering shock, swelling, undeniable pride, and immense, completely overwhelming relief. He reached out with a noticeably trembling, deeply calloused right hand and firmly grasped Gideon's remarkably thick, tightly leather-clad left forearm. "You must keep my only daughter completely safe, Hayes. Do you understand me? You take her high up that distant mountain immediately, and you do not look back for a single fleeting second today. I will permanently handle things here." With these extremely detailed financial ledgers you bravely brought here, Josiah Trent is completely, utterly finished in this entire Western Territory forever. The territorial federal marshal will surely see to it personally. Gideon slowly gave the older, completely broken farmer a single, deeply respectful, silent nod of absolute understanding. He will absolutely not ever lay a single filthy finger on her again, Mercer. You have my solemn, unbreakable word as a man on that fact today. If he ever foolishly tries, he deals directly with me. Gideon calmly placed a highly protective, incredibly heavy right hand on the small of Abigail's trembling back and gently guided her back down the long central aisle. The completely stunned sea of formally dressed local townsfolk rapidly parted for them instantly, fearfully shrinking back tightly against the wooden pews. No person uttered a single, solitary word of loud protest or angry condemnation anywhere. Sheriff Ezekiel Cobb pathetically remained cowardly, pinned forcefully against the back wooden pew, his noticeably round face incredibly slick with extremely cold, terrified, nervous sweat, completely and utterly unwilling to foolishly challenge the towering, heavily armed mountain man a terrifying second time. But directly outside the supposedly incredibly safe, entirely holy sanctuary of the massive church building, the highly dangerous, incredibly volatile situation was definitely far from being completely resolved peacefully. Josiah Trent had certainly, absolutely not come to his forced, completely fake wedding without very serious, highly lethal insurance. Waiting very impatiently by the sturdy wooden horse hitching posts outside were exactly 4 of his heavily armed, exceedingly dangerous, completely ruthless, hired enforcers standing very quietly in the dusty dirt. They were very hard-eyed, utterly ruthless mercenaries forcefully brought in all the long way from distant Cheyenne who absolutely did not care in the very slightest degree about stolen financial ledgers, complicated local town politics, or any basic moral concepts of right and wrong. They truthfully only cared deeply about the very heavy, extremely shiny gold coins loudly jingling inside their deep pockets today. Their heavily scarred, extremely vicious, incredibly foul-tempered leader, a very cruel man simply named Hollis, aggressively spat a very thick, dark stream of incredibly vile chewing tobacco juice violently into the dry street dust, just as the heavy oak church front doors finally swung wide open, and Gideon purposefully emerged, forcefully, into the bright morning sunlight closely, accompanied by the completely ruined, highly relieved runaway bride standing closely beside him now. "Well now, just look at this," Hollis sneered very loudly, lazily resting his extremely dirty right hand directly on the worn wooden butt of his heavily greased, fully loaded, holstered Colt revolver. "Mister!" Trent is absolutely not going to like this unexpected, highly problematic development one little bit, you stupid mountain man. I strongly suggest you immediately hand the pretty little lady over to us right now, and quickly ride your horse back up to the cold dirt hole you crawled out of before you quickly get yourself shot completely dead in the street. Gideon did not flinch whatsoever. He did not even blink his intensely staring eyes. He quickly and remarkably smoothly positioned Abigail slightly behind his broad back, entirely shielding her fragile frame completely with his massive, highly imposing muscular body right now. The bright morning sun heavily beat down mercilessly upon the very dusty, completely silent main thoroughfare, brilliantly highlighting the incredibly tense, highly deadly standoff happening outside. Gideon suddenly whistled very sharply, producing a very piercing, incredibly high-pitched sound that smoothly cut cleanly through the crisp, thin mountain air, exactly like a sharp, physical steel blade. Instantly, his massive, midnight black stallion trotted over very quickly from the dark livery, stable located directly across the wide street, fully saddled, heavily provisioned, and completely ready to ride extremely hard. "Get up on the horse, Abigail," Gideon commanded very softly, his stormy gray eyes remaining intensely locked securely onto Hollis and the three other armed men slowly fanning out across the wide, dusty street in a highly calculated, highly tactical, half-circle formation. "I absolutely ain't gonna ask you twice." Hollis grinned darkly, his greasy fingers twitching nervously as he rapidly began to quickly draw his incredibly lethal weapon out from its heavily greased leather hip sheath. Before Hollis could even quickly raise the incredibly heavy steel gun barrel to actually take a proper, deadly aim, Gideon's highly trusted Winchester lever-action rifle was smoothly off his extremely broad shoulder and perfectly leveled instantly in the chaotic blink of an eye. He did not shoot to kill. He absolutely explicitly shot to permanently, painfully dismantle the immediate deadly threat before him. The rifle cracked violently like booming thunder echoing loudly off the incredibly steep surrounding valley walls. Hollis suddenly screamed out loudly and completely blinding. Absolute agony as the heavy lead bullet completely, utterly shattered his right kneecap instantly, dropping the tough mercenary face first down today. In the blindingly fast blink of an eye, Gideon fluidly pumped the lever and accurately fired twice more with utterly terrifying, extremely mechanical precision. The second deafening shot smoothly blew the heavy iron pistol cleanly right out of the desperately reaching hand of a panicked thug grabbing for his belt holster, forcefully sending the totally shattered gun spinning wildly away through the air. The highly perfect third aimed bullet completely took the thick wooden heel clean off the third hired man's left boot, violently sending him instantly sprawling backward directly into the incredibly deep, extremely muddy horse water trough situated directly in front of the local blacksmith shop. The sheer, overwhelmingly dominant speed and absolutely terrifying, supernatural accuracy of the rugged mountain man left the fourth and final hired enforcer entirely standing, completely frozen now. What an incredible journey of courage, defying corrupt power, and finding true love where you least expect it. Abigail and Gideon proved that sometimes you have to break all the rules to find your real home. If this Wild West romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Share this epic story with a friend who loves a rugged hero, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, heart-pounding tales from the untamed frontier.
Hi, my name is Royal Trials, the owner and manager of Royal Trials. After watching the video, Mountain Man spotted tears on the bride's face. What he did at the altar stunned the town. I'd really like to know what you think. How did the story make you feel? What stood out to me was the feeling of compassion and the importance of paying attention to what someone else might be going through. Sometimes, a single moment of understanding can change the direction of a story. And it reminds us that kindness often begins with simply noticing another person's emotions. Do you think most people would have reacted the same way in that situation? And what part of the story stayed with you the longest? I'd be interested to hear how different viewers interpreted the choices that were made and what they meant to them. In everyday life, it might be as simple as slowing down and checking in on someone who seems upset instead of making assumptions. Small moments of empathy can go a long way. Thanks for watching and being part of the Royal Trials community. If this story gave you something to think about, feel free to leave a comment below. And if you enjoy these Mountain Man stories, a like or subscription is always appreciated if you feel the channel is worth following.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, Mountain Man spotted tears on the bride's face. What he did at the altar stunned the town. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of courage and compassion in a moment when it mattered most. Sometimes people notice things that others overlook, and choosing to act with honesty and kindness can change the course of a situation. This story reminds us that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it can make a meaningful difference. What do you think was going through the Mountain Man's mind when he saw the bride's tears? And if you had been there, how do you think you would have responded to the situation? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. One lesson we can take from this story is to pay attention to the people around us and trust our instincts when something doesn't seem right. A little empathy and willingness to help can go a long way. If this story resonated with you, feel free to leave a comment. And if you'd like to see more stories like this, consider liking the video and subscribing to Rugged Heart Man.